To the rest of the world, my uncle and I were the polished face of a real estate dynasty worth close to $900 million. We attended charity galas in downtown Toronto, flew to Vancouver for quarterly reviews, and smiled for photographs in the kind of publications that ran glossy spreads about families building Canada's future. That was the version of us that existed in press releases. The real version was two kids who got handed a letter on the morning of my 20th birthday and told to leave before dinner. I still have that letter. Not because I kept it out of sentimentality. I kept it because my lawyer told me to. It's in a manila envelope in a filing cabinet now, tucked between tax documents and mortgage papers, which feels about right. Cold things belong with other cold things. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, the one everyone called Owen, but whose full name was Owen Patrick Callister, the one who had been more of a brother to me than an uncle since my parents died when I was 11. He was the one who read it first. We were sitting in the kitchen of the main house in Oakville, the one with the wraparound porch and the sugar maple out front that my grandmother had planted the year she got married. Owen read the letter twice without saying anything, and then he set it down on the granite countertop and looked out the window for a long time. "We need to pack," he said. That was it. No dramatic speech, no tears, at least not yet. Just those three words, and the sound of the maple branches scraping against the window in the November wind. The letter was from my stepfather, Douglas. I'd taken to calling him that in my head, even though he'd never officially adopted me. He was the man my grandmother had married 6 years after my grandfather passed, the man who had methodically and quietly taken over everything my grandfather built. The letter said, in the carefully constructed language of someone who had consulted lawyers before putting pen to paper, that Owen and I were no longer considered members of the household, that our access to family accounts was being revoked effective immediately, and that we had until the end of the week to remove our personal belongings. It said personal belongings, not our belongings, not your belongings. It said our, like the house and everything in it, already belonged to him so completely that even the language had been transferred. Owen had worked for that company for 8 years. He'd done the Muskoka acquisitions. He'd negotiated the entire Brampton portfolio. He was 29 years old and had given his best years to an organization that had just handed him a manila envelope. I was 20, a second-year student at McMaster, and I had $42 in my personal checking account. We spent the first 2 nights at a motel off the QEW. Owen paid. He'd had a personal savings account that Douglas apparently hadn't known about or hadn't bothered to freeze. And there was enough to keep us fed and sheltered for a few weeks if we were careful. We sat in the motel room with the heater rattling against the wall and talked about options. The way people talk about options when they have very few of them. Listing things out loud just to feel like the situation was manageable, even when it clearly wasn't. On the 3rd morning, Owen found something in his jacket pocket. He'd been wearing that jacket, the old brown canvas one he'd had since university, the day we packed, and he hadn't thought about it since. He pulled it out of his pocket and held it up, a small key on a plain ring with a piece of yellowed masking tape wrapped around the bow. In my grandfather's handwriting, in the faded block letters I recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists pinned to the fridge, it said, Harrowfield. For when you need it. Owen and I looked at each other across the laminate motel table. My grandfather, his name was Thomas. Though nobody called him that, everyone called him Tom. Had died 3 years before Douglas came into the picture. He'd built the company from a single property management office in Hamilton in the 1970s and spent 40 years quietly accumulating holdings across southern Ontario. He was not a sentimental man. He was precise and methodical, and he measured his words the same way he measured square footage. Exactly, with nothing wasted. He was not the kind of man who left cryptic keys with cryptic notes unless he meant them to be found. Owen said, Harrowfield, I said. I know where that is. My grandfather had a piece of land up in the Haliburton Highlands. Not a cottage, he'd never been a cottage person, said the tourist economy made property values artificial. It was a parcel of land he'd bought in the late 80s, 240 acres of mixed forest and exposed Canadian shield, with a small structure on it that he'd always referred to simply as the field property. He took me there twice when I was a child, both times in autumn when the birch trees went gold and the lakes turned the color of old pewter. He'd never taken anyone else, as far as I knew. The property wasn't in any of the company documents I'd ever seen. It wasn't something Douglas would know about. We drove up the next morning. Owen's car was a 12-year-old Honda Civic with 240,000 kilometers on it. The one thing in his life that was fully, unambiguously his, and we loaded it with the bags we'd packed and drove north out of the city as the sun came up behind us. The highway gave way to provincial roads, and the provincial roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel eventually gave way to a 2-track path through mature spruce and jackpine that I only recognized because I'd been there as a child, and I'd been paying attention even then. The structure was at the end of the track, set back from a small clearing where a creek bent around a shelf of granite. It was larger than I remembered. A 2-story log building with a metal roof and a deep covered porch, the kind of construction that people in Ontario don't build anymore because it takes patience and the belief that something should last longer than a generation. There was a heavy padlock on the front door, the kind you'd see on a storage facility. Owen held up the key. "Only one way to know," he said. It took some coaxing. The lock had been there for years, and the mechanism was stiff, but it opened. The door swung in with the particular smell of a sealed space, wood and dry cold, and something faintly chemical like oil or treated lumber. Owen found a light switch just inside the door, and the overhead lights flickered on. My grandfather had prepared for us. That's the only way I know how to say it. He had prepared. The space was clean, the kind of clean that comes from surfaces being treated rather than just wiped. Someone had sealed everything against moisture. There were shelves along 2 walls, stocked with the kind of non-perishable supplies that emergency preparedness guides recommend. Canned goods, water containers, a first aid kit still in its packaging. There was a wood stove with a cord and a half of split birch stacked beside it. There was a narrow bed frame with a mattress still in its plastic wrapping, and a fold-out cot leaning against the wall beside it. And on the work table in the center of the room, weighted down by a small river stone, was an envelope. The same block lettering, the same precise hand. Thomas Owen Callister Jr. and Ian. Owen's full name and mine. Both of us. He'd known. Somehow, years before any of this happened, he had known that there might come a day when the two of us needed a place to go. Owen picked up the envelope and sat down on the edge of the stacked firewood. I sat beside him. He opened it carefully, the way you open something when you understand that the paper itself is irreplaceable. There were 3 things inside: a handwritten letter, a smaller sealed envelope marked "Do not open until you have read this in full," and a business card for a law firm in Guelph, Whitmore and Associates, with a name circled in blue ink, Patrick Whitmore, senior partner. The letter was 8 pages, written in my grandfather's dense, unhurried handwriting on paper that had clearly been stored with care. It began simply: "If you're reading this, then I was right to prepare. I'm not going to try to reproduce every word of that letter here. Some of it was personal. Things he said about Owen's mother, about my parents, about the years after my grandmother died, and the grief that left him more vulnerable than he'd expected. But the core of it was this: my grandfather had suspected for a long time that the man who eventually became his common-law partner's husband had not come into their lives by accident. Douglas Hart, that was his full name, Douglas Warren Hart, had appeared in my grandmother's social circle with a precision that my grandfather found, in retrospect, too neat. He had arrived already knowing the right people, already positioned to be useful, already carrying the specific kind of charm that makes wealthy older women feel seen and understood. My grandfather had quietly begun to pay attention. Over the course of 2 years, before his health declined too sharply for him to continue, he had documented what he found. The second envelope contained a USB drive. We sat with it in our hands for a long time before Owen said, quietly, We need to get to Guelph. Patrick Whitmore was 71 years old, semi-retired, and the kind of lawyer who had a handshake like a closing argument. He had been my grandfather's personal lawyer for 30 years. He had been expecting our call. "Tom told me you'd come eventually," he said, when we sat down across from him in his office 3 days later. "He wasn't sure when. He was very certain you would. He told us what he could tell us without the drive." My grandfather had been thorough. He had hired a private investigator, a retired RCMP officer from the Kitchener area who had worked financial crimes, and over 18 months, the two of them had documented what appeared to be a long-running pattern of what the lawyer carefully called interest conflicts and fiduciary irregularities. Douglas, it turned out, had a history. Two previous relationships with wealthy families in the Hamilton-Burlington corridor, both of which had ended with those families substantially diminished and Douglas substantially enriched. The pattern was clean enough that it had never attracted official scrutiny, but ragged enough that, documented properly, it told a very clear story. "The USB drive," Mr. Whitmore said, "contained everything. Before we look at what's on this," Owen said, "I need to know something." He leaned forward. "Can he come after us for accessing it? We found it on property that's technically under his control through the estate." Mr. Whitmore allowed himself a small smile. "The Harrowfield property was never part of the estate. Your grandfather held it through a numbered company that predates his relationship with your grandmother by 15 years. It's yours, both of yours, and has been since the day he changed the holding documents. Douglas doesn't know it exists. As far as the official record of the Callister estate is concerned, Tom owned no rural property." Owen sat back. "I thought about the key, the masking tape, the block letters. For when you need it." He'd been planning this for years. Not in a paranoid way. In the way that a man who builds things for a living understands that structures need foundations, that you pour the concrete before you lay the walls, that the things that hold everything up are usually the things nobody sees. The drive contained financial records spanning 11 years, internal communications, a series of emails between Douglas and an associate in Calgary, a man named Bryce, operating through a numbered company, detailing what amounted to a deliberate strategy of asset dilution. Properties in the portfolio had been quietly undervalued in internal reports. Deals that should have been flagged for board review had been routed through a subsidiary Douglas controlled. Consultancy fees had been paid out to a company that, traced back far enough, turned out to be owned by a family member of Douglas's who existed nowhere in the official disclosure documents. The number the accountant eventually put to it, when Mr. Whitmore brought in a forensic accounting firm from Mississauga, was $4.2 million over 9 years. There was also something else on the drive, a folder simply labeled Ridgecroft. Inside it were documents relating to a development project in the Niagara region, a seniors' housing project that had received provincial government funding and had been positioned publicly as a flagship community benefit initiative. The internal documents told a different story. The project had been deliberately overcapitalized, the construction costs inflated through a network of subcontractors, with the overrun absorbed by the provincial grant, while the difference went to a holding company registered in Nova Scotia. It was the kind of scheme that, in Canada, attracts the attention of both the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit and, depending on the specifics, the Competition Bureau. Owen looked at me across the boardroom table. "This is bigger than just us. It took 4 months. I'm going to be honest about that. 4 months of meetings in lawyers' offices, of submitting documentation, of waiting while people in government departments reviewed files and forwarded them to other departments. Mr. Whitmore guided us through all of it. He had contacts at the Ontario Securities Commission from his years doing corporate litigation, and he knew the right person at the Federal Department of Justice to ensure the Ridgecroft file landed where it would receive the most serious attention. During those 4 months, Owen and I lived at Harrowfield. We cut firewood. We drove into Minden for groceries. We used the property's landline and our phones sparingly. We didn't tell anyone where we were. It was the strangest 4 months of my life, and also, in some way I couldn't have anticipated, some of the most peaceful. There's something that happens when you strip everything back. No obligations, no performance, no pretending that a family is something it isn't. And you're left with just the cold and the fire, and the person sitting across from you who actually chose to be there. Owen and I talked more in those 4 months than we had in years. We talked about my parents. We talked about what it had been like for him to watch me grow up without them. We talked about what we actually wanted, not from the company, not from the estate, but from whatever came next. I turned 21 in that cabin. Owen made a cake from a boxed mix. It was not a great cake. It was the best birthday I'd had in years. The RCMP executed a search warrant on the Callister Group offices on a Tuesday morning in March. I know the date because Mr. Whitmore called us at 7:15 a.m., the earliest he'd ever called, and said, simply, "It's begun." Douglas was at the office when they arrived. I wasn't there. I'd been asked not to be, which was fine. What I know is what the public record eventually showed, and what Mr. Whitmore told us afterward. Douglas Hart was escorted from the building at approximately 9:40 a.m. The associate in Calgary, the man named Bryce, was arrested separately. 3 other individuals connected to the Ridgecroft project were also named in the charges. The legal process was long, and I won't walk through all of it. What matters is this. Douglas was charged under the criminal code with fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty, and, in connection with the provincial grant scheme, fraud against the government. He was ultimately convicted on all primary counts and sentenced to 6 years in a federal institution. The associate received 4. The civil proceedings that followed resulted in a recovery order that returned a substantial portion of the misappropriated assets to the Callister estate. An estate that, as it turned out, Owen and I were entitled to as the surviving direct descendants of Thomas Patrick Callister. What we recovered wasn't everything. Years of deliberate dilution had reduced the portfolio significantly, and the litigation costs were considerable. But between the recovered assets, the estate we were rightfully entitled to, and, yes, to answer the question I've been asked, a whistleblower recognition payment through the federal program, we were not starting from nothing. Owen bought a small property in Prince Edward County. He's been renovating it slowly, doing most of the work himself, which he finds satisfying in a way that spreadsheets never were. I finished my degree. I transferred to U of T for my final 2 years, and I'm in my first year of law school now, which surprises me more than anyone. We kept Harrowfield. That wasn't even a discussion. The day after the sentencing, Owen drove up with a new padlock, not to seal it, but to replace the old one, to make it properly ours. We spent the weekend there, the first time we'd been back since we'd stopped living there, and it felt different from the outside now that the emergency was over. Smaller in some ways, bigger in others. My grandfather had never told me what the property was for. He'd taken me there as a child and shown me the land and the creek and the granite shelf where the water ran clear, and he hadn't explained it. I think now that he was showing it to me the way you show someone something you want them to remember, without wanting to burden them with why. He knew what was coming, not in specific detail, but in the way that people who have built things understand how they can be dismantled, and he was making sure that whatever else happened, there would be one piece of solid ground. The greatest inheritance he left me wasn't the estate. It wasn't the portfolio, or the $4.2 million, or the whistleblower payment. It was the key on the piece of masking tape, and the 8 pages of handwriting, and the quiet, unwavering certainty. Written before I was old enough to need it, that I was someone worth protecting. I have his handwriting framed now. Just one page, the one where he says, "The men who take things have always existed, so have the men who outlast them. You will outlast this." He was right.